Climate change is a fact of life. Weather patterns are getting wilder. Glaciers are melting and sea levels are rising. Millions of people around the world are at risk.
We will respond to the threat of climate change.
The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has established that warming of the climate system is unequivocal.
The threat of climate change is real.
And it's not just one study. 34 different national academies of science agree that climate change is man-made.
We have no time to lose in tackling this crisis.
So where's the debate? A few skeptics, most of them not climate scientists, say all of this is alarmism. They're not bothered by rising carbon emissions. Professor Richard Lindzen is perhaps the world's best-known climate skeptic. He's a professor of meteorology at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. My name is Mehdi Hassan, and tonight I'll be challenging Professor Lindzen at the Oxford Union, going head-to-head over his controversial view that warnings about the dangers of climate change are just scaremongering. Can you please welcome Professor Richard Lindzen? A hero to climate skeptics across the world. The professor has famously said that if he's wrong about global warming, we'll know in 50 years and can do something then. Professor Lindzen.
Yes?
Are you a climate skeptic or are you a climate denier? Let's get our terminology straight here. You've been called a lot of things. What do you describe yourself as?
Well, probably neither. I mean, I would deny the alarmism. Certainly believe in climate change. I think temperatures do change. So I'm not sure. Labels are not always helpful.
So let's move beyond labels and let's just get to the point of why it is, in many people's eyes, you are so controversial. Because the mainstream, if I can use that word, to use another label, climate science, says the planet is warming, man is responsible for much of that warming that's going on right now, and we need to cut back greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. What do you disagree with in that?
Okay. The first two are reasonably uncontroversial, although, as always, there are details. I don't think there's a lot of question as to whether temperature has increased a bit over the last 200 years. Most of the temperature increase, in fact, has occurred before the impact of CO2 is very significant. Climate is always changing, so, you know, how one views that is perhaps a personal issue. That man is responsible for some of that is entirely possible. What we do know is there is a greenhouse effect. We know that if you add CO2, all other things kept constant, you should get some warming. The estimates are if you doubled CO2, you might see a degree, roughly. Whether you could establish how much of what we have observed is due to man.
Well, let me, on that specific point then, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which was established by the UN, it said in its most recent report, its fourth report, which reflects the work of, I think, 600 scientists in 41 countries, they said most of the observed increase in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic, i.e. man-made greenhouse gas concentrations. It says warming of the climate system is unequivocal, as is now evident from observations of increases in global average air temperatures, widespread melting of snow and ice, rising global average sea level. What do you dispute in that?
Okay. The statement itself that most of the warming since 1950 or 60, is due to man's emissions, it's possible. I think,
Not very likely, as the IPCC says.
you know, no one knows where their estimate, 90% likely came from. It's very hard to identify. The most recent works I've seen suggest that it may be on the order of half. Now remember, we're talking about a few tenths of a degree. The real controversy comes with the last part, not of this statement, but of the statement that having seen this, we must cut our emissions. Because the presumption is that these, which I call reasonably innocent statements, imply disaster. Now, to put it into perspective, let us say that man's emissions accounted, let's say greenhouse gas emissions, accounted for all of it. That would be entirely compatible with no problem.
No problem.
No problem. I mean, it would say that we might expect by the next century a degree or so, and there is little doubt that man has dealt with much more than that.
Okay, well, on that note, you mentioned the question mark about the IPCC. Professor Miles Allen is a professor of geosystem science at the Department of Geography here in the Department of Physics here at Oxford University. He's also served on several IPCC reports. How do you respond to Professor Lindzen when he says, where does this 90% figure come from?
The evidence is entirely consistent with most of the warming, or indeed all the warming, being driven by the the build-up of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which puts the future into perspective when we think about the fact that we had, 250 years ago, 4 trillion tons of fossil carbon underground. We've burnt about 500 billion tons and caused somewhere between 3/4 of a degree and a degree of warming. That's taken us 250 years. We'll burn the next 500 billion tons in 35 years. We'll burn the next 500 billion tons in maybe 30 years. And we'll burn the next, we're not going to stop doing this because fossil fuels are such a fantastically useful resource. So that's where I see a mismatch between saying most of the warming to date is due to this build-up of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the statement that we won't see very substantial warming in the future if emissions continue, because that's exactly what's happening. This stuff is building up.
Well, first of all, I think the IPCC was properly cautious in saying most. I think you'd have a hard time arguing for all, but even if it were all, if you double CO2, you create an imbalance in the radiation. That is the source of the warming. We're already actually quite close to the doubling.
My point is, it's clearly not going to stop at doubling. I mean, people who say we're going to avoid doubling CO2, I would agree with you. It's going to be very hard to do that. But if we carry on burning fossil fuels without doing anything, we're heading for tripling, quadrupling, whatever. I mean, there's plenty of fossil fuel down there. That's my point.
Yeah, and
I mean, so they keep finding more.
Where does one go from there?
Let me come back to a point you made earlier about the alarmism.
Yeah.
What you don't sound to alarmism. And you mentioned the IPCC was rightly cautious. A lot of people say, scientists, environmentalists, politicians even, that the IPCC is too cautious, too sober, that in fact, for example, their predictions, their modeling, their forecasts don't match up to what we're seeing around the world right now. You know, superstorms and heat waves in the United States, droughts and floods in Australia, England having its wettest year ever last year. I mean, the IPCC, you could argue, is too cautious.
Well, perhaps
not alarmist enough.
One of the questions is not, we've seen warming of a few tenths of a degree, we must do something. The question is, how much do you expect? And that is the issue of climate sensitivity. And that's still a very open question.
When you say it's an open question, how representative are you of scientific opinion? Because there is this debate, we talked about labels.
Oh, look.
People say you're fringe, you're extreme, you're marginal.
How should I put it?
The IPCC reflects mainstream science, thousands of scientists across the world.
How should I put it? I've served on the IPCC, and the agreement was we would say nothing that was untrue. But there was clearly a bias. You were not to attack models, you were not to do this unless it was absolutely essential.
When you say bias, it's not just the IPCC, is it? I mean, 34 national academies of science across the world, your countries, my countries, Sweden,
What have they said? What
India,
have they said?
China.
Yeah, and what have they said?
They have all signed up to the consensus position that the
Yes.
planet is warming, that man is responsible largely for that warming, and that greenhouse gas emissions have to be cut down.
Yeah, and it's the third.
And they're all wrong. All those national academies, they're all biased.
Most of these bodies have issued that statement without reference to their membership. So that's another problem with this issue. Why have societies that have nothing to do with this issue felt necessary to issue statements? And the statements always begin with what I call the trivial agreement, and then lead to a policy conclusion that this is dangerous. At any rate, that's one of the questions.
But what's the answer? Why have 34 national academies of science put out these statements? Why has NASA? Why has the World Meteorological
NASA
Organization?
has been conflicted on this, but
Why is the Geological Society of America? Why is the International Geophysical Union?
I think that's a fair question. Why do the agricultural societies say this?
What's
Why
the
did
answer?
the American Statistical Society? I have no idea. I do have some ideas. They've been told, issue a statement on this.
They've been told by who?
Well, I'd rather not say, to be honest.
Why not?
Why? Because in each case, it would be in some ways embarrassing. I mean, each of them are dependent on the goodwill of the government. And if they're told, sign on, they'll sign on.
It sounds like, if you're talking about 34 national academies of science in countries as diverse as China, Sweden, America, it sounds like a big global conspiracy.
Let me ask you, what content is there in what you're saying?
David Rose is wanting to come in here. David Rose is a special investigations reporter for the Mail on Sunday, contributing editor of Vanity Fair. David?
First of all, I'd like to say that your argument that because 34 academies of science hold a view, it must be right, is daft. If you go back in history, before Copernicus, before Galileo, you could get a fantastic consensus enforced by the Inquisition that the Earth was the center of the universe. One of the curious paradoxes of this whole debate is that from the very beginning, it gained a far greater political traction than a scientific traction. Politicians and policymakers began to assume, using this so-called precautionary principle, a kind of doomsday, apocalyptic view of what was happening. Now, with the enforcement of that consensus...
Who's enforcing?
Well,
Professor Lindsay,
hold on.
who do you think is
Let me
enforcing?
just
You're using
my
big
point.
words.
Wait, let me finish
You're comparing
my point.
it to the Inquisition and Copernicus.
Yes, it is
who's
like
doing the enforcing, David?
The issue is not whether there is global warming. The issue is not whether a large
for some
component
people.
is being caused by human beings. The issue is how fast and how far is that happening. That consensus is falling apart.
Well, let's bring in Mark Linus, who is an author on this subject, an activist. He has advised the Maldives government at the Copenhagen summit in 2009. Take on board David's point that this is comparable to Galileo, Copernicus.
I actually think there is a very respectable position to be sceptical on every issue. You should always ask for evidence. You should never just take something as true because it's given by authorities. However, there comes a point where the consensus amongst the experts, 99 experts out of 100 say that we've got a really serious problem here in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, then that's something which concerns me. And I could listen to Professor Lindson's very reassuring, very calm, slightly dismissive attitude and say, well, okay, we can carry on pouring greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and carrying on this enormous experiment with the Earth, but actually I don't think that's a very sensible, very precautionary position. And if you want to take a kind of balance of risk approach, the fact that we burn 1,100 tons of carbon dioxide and release those into the atmosphere every single second, the fact that we're potentially pushing the climate back to where it was 50 million years ago, way outside anything that humans have evolutionary experience of, actually really does concern me.
Dr. Miles Allen, Professor Allen, who is telling you what to think?
I've never had anybody threaten me with thumbscrews. I find this idea that there's some kind of inquisition out there that tells scientists what to conclude. I find that kind of weird, and nor has anybody ever told me that I'll lose my funding if I don't go with the... No, well, I'm telling you, nobody's ever threatened me with thumbscrews. That is a true fact.
And among my grad students, there's always an understanding that they will play down anything that suggests this is not a major problem.
David's a layperson, I'm a layperson. If David and I are in a room together, we're taking different positions on this. I can't just ignore the fact that when polled, 97% of climate scientists sign up to the consensus.
Where were they polled? Where were they polled?
Were they polled in a torture chamber? You tell me, where were they polled?
I don't know where they were
Guantanamo
polled.
Bay?
I have no idea. But I mean,
you keep posing these questions. Where's the answer? Where were they polled?
Well,
as one of the 97%, I'd like to agree with David Rose, it's completely irrelevant. Okay, science is not a democracy. We don't vote on things, we look at the evidence. Okay?
But I, as a layperson, should ignore the fact that 97%
No, I'm not
has
telling
been
you to
working in
ignore
this
the
field.
fact. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying that's not the way science works. I don't think that's a helpful way to frame the discussion.
Professor Lindsay mentioned papers. Is it not the case that when a study was done of all the papers that have been published, a summary of the scientific evidence on this, what was it, something like 928 papers, zero, none of them disagree with the consensus? They're all wrong as well?
this is one of the reasons I think you, as a citizen, as opposed to a scientist, should be extraordinarily suspicious. What in the world was that study about? It was saying, when you got down to it, and it was, you know, there have been various such studies, they looked through all these papers to see if they contradicted that there was a greenhouse effect and there was warming. Many of these papers had nothing to do with that at all. I wouldn't even have disagreed with it. Why was something like that trotted out to make you feel there's a terrible problem? That should be what you should be suspicious of.
David and then Professor Allen.
You're creating this bogus idea of consensus. There is a consensus on the basics, but no, wait. On the detail, there is no consensus, and there is less consensus with every passing month, because the areas of further investigation, the areas which are being questioned, are far less, to use another favourite word, settled than is sometimes made out.
Mark's been waiting patiently.
I actually don't agree with Miles. It's fine for Miles because he is a scientist, and Professor Lindsay is a scientist, and those of us who aren't, and I was in a position of having to advise a head of state about what to do about climate change. He was concerned because he was in charge of a country which potentially, you know, it's only about that high above, about a metre above sea level, the Maldives. Potentially this country is going to go out of existence. It won't see out this century if rising sea levels continue to accelerate because of the melting of the ice sheets, which is also projected as a sort of fairly obvious impact as the Earth warms. Now, he's not going to read through all of these thousands of scientific papers. There does come a point, actually, where you have to say, well, the balance of evidence, because pretty much all of the experts agree on this, is that we should take a very precautionary stance, and we should go to the international fora at Copenhagen. We should say to the rest of the world, for the sake of our survival as a nation, yes, you must cut your greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay. Could I?
David was talking about tropical storms. The IPCC does agree that the risk of heat waves is being enhanced, or likely to be being enhanced, by anthropogenic warming. Agree there is no consensus that there's any discernible role of human influence in tropical storms. They're different extreme events. Some extreme events are being made more likely. It's very possible that others, extreme blizzard risk in the UK, may be being made less likely by human influence on climate. The weather is changing. I think we can agree on that.
As someone who involved in the peer review process, unlike David and I, what's your response to Richard's line about these journals being outliers, these articles being, you know, reviewers being brought in, etc.? There is a, forgive me, a sense of conspiracy I keep getting here.
No. The IPCC doesn't rely on a single article. I mean, we're always really careful whenever I've been, I'm sure in the chapters Dick's been involved in as well, you'd have been the same. We're very careful to look for a range of articles and also to understand the evidence behind the articles, not just to say because the article's there it's necessarily correct. And, you know, so that's why I keep coming back to we need to look at the evidence rather than sort of just looking at the numbers.
Where is the fundamental disagreement, do you believe, between you two?
Given the accelerating rate at which CO2 is accumulating in the atmosphere as emissions rise, we should expect an accelerating commitment to warming. So the statement that we've only seen a little bit of warming so far means it won't matter in the future, we won't see any warming in the future, flies in the face of our basic understanding of the way the carbon cycle and the climate system works.
Let me ask you a question about some of the politics of this, because you suggested implicitly at the start of this program and elsewhere you've suggested explicitly that some of the climate scientists working in this field are pressured, they're doing it for political reasons, job reasons, financial reasons, but your critics would say that the reverse is true, that in fact the kind of small band of people who disagree with the consensus, however you want to define it, are actually the people who are getting funding from the fossil fuel industry, from big oil, from big coal. Does it bother you that those are the kind of people who are on your side?
No. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm terrifically happy about that. I don't know what you're talking about.
Really, there's no funding going from ExxonMobil or...
Oh yeah, there is.
The Koch brothers.
Koch brothers, I've never seen any funding from. They've never given any to people who are skeptics.
Really, they don't give money to the various kind of centre-right think tanks in the United States that publish so much stuff about global warming being a myth, the Cato Institute, the Heartland Institute. They don't get money from these people?
They may get, but it's a small amount compared to what the environmental movement puts on. I don't know what their bookkeeping is. I know in the science community, nobody is being supported by ExxonMobil. Most of the fossil fuel industry has actually gone out of its way to endorse climate alarm. BP, Shell, official positions beyond petroleum. ExxonMobil has given $100 million to people who promote this issue.
Okay, I'll come to you in 1 second, David. I just want to bring in Mark there, who has in the past campaigned on this issue as well as written about it, worked in it. The environmental movement doles out far more money in the climate science debate than the oil companies, which are not a vested interest.
I'm not sure that's true, but I haven't done the figures either. I'm not going to sit here and accuse Professor Linson of taking money from a fossil fuel company. I have no idea. I'm sure.
What role does ExxonMobil play in this debate? They don't play any role at all?
Oh, I think there's been strong links with some of the climate skeptic think tanks and funding from fossil fuel companies. That's very well demonstrated. So I don't think that's anything that can be denied. But the question is who's right and who's wrong here.
An example would be helpful.
Here's an example. I once had an airfare paid for by, I believe, ExxonMobil. It didn't make a scrap of difference to what I said at the other end of the plane ride. I'm sorry. I mean, this is irrelevant. It really is irrelevant.
That's why I'm not making that same allegation. But the whole of humanity is dependent on fossil fuels here. I took a flight across the Atlantic about 2 weeks ago. I emitted a ton of carbon. So I am involved in this business too. It's not just ExxonMobil. We have to find a way to support human civilization without emitting huge amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
Of course, when we all fly. I was asking specifically about the lobbying efforts.
I think there's lobbying on both sides, actually. I don't make any great accusations. I think that we have to take perspectives seriously when they are scientific ones, and this is all very mixed up with ideology. This is an ideological debate. I think Professor Linson's made it fairly clear that he's on the sort of free market side of the argument, which is fine. He can have that, but we've got to remember where people are coming from. They're often speaking very politically when they have this, because they're reacting against what they perceive as a sort of state intervention in the economy and the things that they think are coming with climate change.
We're going to bring this part to an end. Join us in part 2 of Head to Head, where we're carrying on the discussion on climate change with Professor Linson, and our audience will be coming in part 2, so don't go away. Welcome back to part 2 of Head to Head this week here again in the Oxford Union. I'm joined by Professor Richard Linson of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the world's best-known critics of what some call the consensus position on climate change. Professor Linson, before we go on any further, just very quickly, we talked about where people should get knowledge from, information on this subject, where you and some other scientists, many other scientists disagree. You talked about alarmism earlier. If somebody comes and says to you, should I stop recycling? Should I drive less? Should I fly less? Should I try and save more energy around the house? Would you tell them not to do it? What's your advice to them?
I think it depends on why they're doing it.
Because they're worried about warming.
Oh, for that purpose, I would say that it's probably futile. These gestures are feel-good gestures. There's something rather retrograde about this issue, in the sense that you have people looking for omens in the peculiarities, the everyday and normal peculiarities of weather, and then making sacrifices in order to appease the gods of Gaia or whatever it is, regardless of the relevance of those sacrifices to the issue at hand.
You're not a fan of the environmental movement, are you?
No, not particularly.
Why not?
Well, I distinguish between a concern for the environment and a political environmental movement. They occasionally seem to do things that don't seem to particularly help the environment. And so I have the feeling that just another authoritarian feel-good movement capitalizing on God knows what good sentiments of people and taking advantage of it. It's become a big business in its own right, I suppose. But no, I don't particularly find most of the environmental movement very attractive.
Mark Linus is here, who's an author, activist, former advisor to government. You mentioned earlier in part one, it's very political. When you hear people who are campaigning for climate change, worried about the environment, worried about what's going on across the world, described as authoritarian, is that something you share, agree, disagree?
I'm not sure that's so accurate. I mean, I have my own differences with much of the environmental movement over nuclear power, and I couldn't understand why the environmental movement wanted to close down one of our largest sources of low-carbon energy, and persist in doing so, despite the fact that they're so concerned about climate change. There's an obvious conflict there which isn't resolved.
But as you say, you're in disagreement over the means to an end.
Right.
The end is you share that greenhouse gas emissions have to come down in order to prevent.
Exactly, and I don't think the environmental movement's got it wrong on climate. There's some areas where it has, but actually I think on climate they've been very close to the science, and that includes groups like Greenpeace. I think they've done actually a very good job on climate change. What annoys me is that the solutions which are proposed are so futile. It was actually a reasonable word for it. The changing light bulbs, the energy efficiency, the wind and solar only. Actually, we need a much broader panoply of solutions to that, which include ways to capture all sorts of different kinds of low carbon energy, which have to be cheaper than what we're doing now. We need to remember this is about economic growth for the developing world. We can't say to the rest of the world they have to go backwards. China's putting in as much coal-fired power plants every 6 months as we have in the whole of this country. You know, this is a huge problem, but we have to find a way to solve it whilst allowing people the aspirations for growth and the aspirations for solving poverty as a way forward.
Mark's agreeing with you on the futility of the small solutions. Of course, you don't agree with the big solutions either. That's part of the alarmism.
How shall I put it? I haven't seen anyone agree to the big solutions in a way that matters. So I think, you know, in that sense, Miles and I and Mark and
Are you saying sorry, people don't agree to big solutions? You mean governments? Or
yeah, look.
Isn't that partly because people like you keep saying there's no consensus, there's nothing need to be done?
Well, how shall I put it? You have a phrasing of the issue, and here I disagree with several environmental groups, you know, who are saying save the planet. We all know that's an extreme statement that doesn't mean anything. The planet has survived far more than this. And yet, what is the value of a statement that's so extreme? Well, it then bypasses any policy issue, anything. You do whatever you can because you don't have a planet anymore. But in a more rational world, we're talking about the potential of some damage, a little damage, maybe a lot. And the question is, what do you do, and how much can you do, and what is worth it to people? What you have is, of course, for the large developing countries like India and China, you know, they're not going to give up their future development for this.
Although their governments take the problem more seriously than you do. You seem much more relaxed than the Indian Environment Minister is, for example.
Yeah, on the other hand, almost all proposed measures have very little impact on climate.
But if you're wrong, as you've accepted there's no 100%, there's all uncertainty, then these same communities, the poorest, most vulnerable people in the world, are at risk.
They may be.
You and I are at much less risk.
Yeah, I agree.
Which is why I don't get why you're so relaxed about this.
Well,
because as you say, you might be wrong. You might be right. You might be wrong. The evidence that's published
by
suggests
nature, I tend to be relaxed, so that's a personal issue. The second thing about it is, if I'm looking at a situation where nobody is actually proposing anything that will do anything for these people except make them poorer, then I have to come out on their side and say, don't bother with this. become less vulnerable.
That's not true. Many, many economists working in this field don't say that at all. They actually say the benefits of tackling climate change now will save money in the long run.
But actually, the best study of that I know, and we've had an argument with Bill Nordhaus over it.
William Nordhaus of Yale University, who says waiting 50 years, as you propose, would cost $4 trillion. Is his figure.
Out of 30 trillion, where he is working to less than one significant figure. I mean, this was ludicrous. If you looked at all his things,
Forgive me, you're an atmospheric physicist. He's an economist working on climate.
But there were economists.
He's ludicrous on the numbers.
No, of course he is. You know, there's no question on that.
Your colleague at the MIT Atmospheric Science Department, Professor Kerry Emanuel, said it just seems deeply unprofessional and irresponsible to look at climate change and say, we're sure it's not a problem. It's a special kind of risk because it's a risk to the collective civilization.
Yeah, I
think your colleague at MIT.
Yes, I know.
So it's not professional just to write it off.
I'm not writing it off. I'm saying if you're in a position where nobody has proposed to do anything except symbolic, and you're arguing, should you make a lot of symbols, you would be doing much better to make people more robust, study the problem better, ascertain these things, don't put pressure on people to find one answer or another, and, you know, stop trying to exaggerate, which is being done with a lot of things.
David, let me ask you a question. If Professor Lindzen is right, and the other climate scientists, the 97%, are wrong, we lose a little bit of economic growth. If he is wrong, and they're right, and we heed his advice, it's much potentially worse consequences, isn't there?
I am not denying that carbon dioxide causes warming, but the critical issue that we are skirting around is what works. This word futile has been used, and the truth is, what we have done has been futile. We have invested colossally, and we're going to invest even more in wind farms. Wind farms are a hopeless solution. Wind farms don't work. They require backup capacity. The cheapest and cleanest way to keep the lights on in this country is building combined cycle gas-powered stations, and they reduce emissions heavily compared to coal.
Your proposal, your solution, to a problem of reducing greenhouse gases, which in part one you were telling is not a problem because it's not warming anymore the world.
No, I didn't say it wasn't warming.
Do you think emissions should come down, yes or no?
In the long run, of course I do.
Okay, good. I'm glad we can bring agreement. I'm sure many of your critics
the question is, how do we achieve it?
Miles Allen.
I think we should really emphasize the enormous amount we all agree on. You know, the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere causes warming. We can argue about how much. Well, okay, maybe there's somebody behind, but I think Dick and I agree on that anyway. So
you agree with that, Professor Lindzen? What do you say? He's not agreeing with you either.
You know, how shall I put it? We'll know if emissions have to come down. But what I really object to, there's a tendency in environmentalism to take something that is bad and demonize it so that no matter how little of it is bad. At the same time, with CO2, the need to diminish it, if you really believe it's a problem, is huge. Symbolic gestures are not about that. And so, you know, doing anything you can, quote, to reduce your carbon footprint is not very...
You waited to come back.
We can all agree that most of the current policies are futile, but that doesn't mean that we don't need a plan to make a transition eventually to a zero carbon economy. It's completely insane the way we're approaching this problem. But just because it's insane, it doesn't mean we don't need a plan to do it. We need a grown-up discussion about other ways of doing it that would work, instead of silly conversations about things that don't work.
Okay, well, on that note, since we're trying to find consensus, I'm judging from some of the spontaneous interventions we've had so far in the show that we've got a diversity of opinion. Let's throw it open to the audience now. I'm going to go to the lady there on the end of that bench to my left.
You know, it's not about whether carbon dioxide is rising or going up and down. Or those factors are variable. That's not the issue. The issue is actually the oil lobby and their impact on government, and that needs to change.
Your view, as you expressed in part one, is that there really is no oil lobby on this subject. You seem to hold this view that they're not vested interests.
The oil industry, as any industry, has interests. They have carefully worked out what their interests are, and their interests are not in opposing concern over global warming. They obviously have an interest in making money, staying in business, and so on. That's true of any business.
I mean, ExxonMobil's lobbying activities, as we discussed, seem to go against that. Let's take some more questions in the audience. Gentleman here has been waiting since he interrupted earlier.
I would like to get back to the more practical, realistic things, and I would like to ask Professor Lindzen to stack up the evidence on both sides of the argument. As my understanding is that almost all of the so-called evidence on the alarmist side is based on computer models.
The consensus view on climate sensitivity is based on models. You run models. No, I mean, you don't agree?
Well, there's two lines of evidence. There's the spread of results from models, and there's also the range. No, I mean, sorry.
Could we just...
No. Hold on.
What is the second line? At any rate, so you have this range of model outputs. If you go to other measurements, there are a number of them. The crudest approach is to look at the temperature change historically, the change in greenhouse forcing, and try somehow to relate that. The IPCC actually tried to play that game. The problem with that game is there are natural sources of variability, which most of the models do terribly on. These are things like El Nino, Southern Oscillation, Pacific Decadal Oscillation, AMO. So without that, you can't use the temperature record. When you attempt to use the temperature record, you do come out smaller by a lot than the models.
Let me just ask, before we go back to the audience, I want to go back to the audience. Dr. Allen, is it fair to say, just to get the different perspective, that the information on one side comes just from models and on the other side from observable experience, observable evidence?
No, I mean, there's two strands of evidence that we bring in, as Professor Lindzen's described. I mean, we use what we can infer from the observations, and we use the range of results models. I personally, as a scientist, tend to prefer what we can infer from observations.
There's several more.
And I mean, there's various types of observations. You can look at the paleo record. You can look at, you know. So
the most important lines of evidence should be the ones that do not depend on the fudge factors.
Dr. Allen, I want to ask you a question. You disagree. I happen to think, Mark happens to think, some other people happen to think that 97% statistic, whatever the statistic, is important. I know you don't agree, but let me just ask you from the perspective of a climate scientist, and then I'll ask Richard. If you were asked where the balance of opinion lies amongst your colleagues on these subjects that we've talked tonight, on the impact of greenhouse gases on the environment, on the need to curb greenhouse, where would it fall?
The broad balance of opinion, as represented by the IPCC reports, for example, are the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. Those reports actually don't always represent an enforced consensus. Quite often, they explain there's a diversity of views on the things. And I think the balance of views expressed in those reports is pretty representative of the scientific community as a whole. I think by and large that process does a pretty good job of gathering together a full range of views and documenting it.
But I think one should clarify something. The iconic statement you made, 90% certainty, et cetera, what percentage of the IPCC Working Group 1 dealt even with that question?
Certainly all the authors on the IPCC report, because I mean we're going through this process for the next assessment, will have discussed that sort of headline statement in plenary, and that's how it works. That's how it was working in Hobart. So all of the authors who were there will have been discussing that statement, arguing over coffee about whether it was justified or not. Believe you me, these are really interesting meetings. We argue a lot.
Yeah, but how many people are involved in that meeting?
There's about 300-400 of us. I don't know the exact number.
Yeah, because my
But as I say, this doesn't go by the numbers. It goes by looking at the evidence.
Is your position, just to be clear, is it that there isn't a consensus, or that the consensus is wrong?
What I'm saying is the notion that you take people from widely varying areas, most of whom have nothing to do with this attribution issue, and ask them to vote on it doesn't make any sense.
We don't sit around and vote. I mean, that's not, and you know that's not the way the IPCC process
what I'm
works.
saying
We're
is
scientists. We sit around and question each other.
Mehdi is suggesting that this is, quote, a consensus view of people working on. Actually, when you come to those hundreds, it is the coordinating lead authors, which is a small group, that has any
That's not
input,
the case.
at least the year I was there.
Okay, the lady here.
To a layperson, it looks like the summers are hotter, the winters are colder, there are more extreme weather events that we have to worry about, the seas are rising. I just want to know, what do you think causes that? And if it's not humans, then I don't have a car, but should my brother trade in his Prius and buy a Hummer or a big SUV? Can we just go out and drive whatever we want?
First of all, pardon me. I mean, you know, anyone who follows the records knows that the summers are not getting hotter. Some are cold, some are hot. The variations occur sporadically over time scales as long as 100 years, maybe longer.
You accept 9 of the last 10 years have been the hottest years on record.
Excuse me, you're confusing a statement about the fact that the temperature rose to something high on the instrumental record by 97 and then has done nothing. And so almost every year at that top layer, even if the trend has stopped, will be among the warmest years. That's apples and pears.
Miles Allen, you've been very keen to get consensus between yourself and Richard Lindzen in this program. Do you agree with him that temperatures aren't going up?
No, nobody's saying global mean temperature anomaly over the last 200 years has gone up on the order of 3/4 of a degree. Nobody in this room can perceive personally global mean temperature anomaly. If you're here in the UK or you're in Boston, the year-to-year variability in temperature can be 2 degrees, 4 degrees, much larger than for the global mean and uncorrelated.
So the more warm summers we can agree on?
I don't think so. You're dealing with very peculiar series.
Gentleman there with the glasses on my left in the back row.
I think that the key issue here is about sensitivity, which is the response of a system to some forcing. Your view is that the climate sensitivity is low. So let's suppose you are right for a second. Now, what about the sensitivity of the climate system added to the sensitivity of the biological system, added to the sensitivity of the social system, added to the sensitivity of the economic system? The sum of all these sensitivities might be very large. We might not need a large climate sensitivity to cause big troubles.
I suppose the more complex you make something, so, you know, yes, everything you do has consequences, and some are bigger than others. I would argue that human beings have shown their capacity to produce economic and political instability far beyond their ability to produce environmental.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to break it down like this now so people don't accuse me of unfairness. Who here, we're going to do agree and disagree. Who here agrees with much of what Professor Lindzen said and would like to come in? Gentleman here has been waiting patiently, and then we'll go to someone who disagrees.
Is the climate literature and the IPCC assessments, are they so completely biased as to make them useless for policymakers, or is there something useful that policymakers can extract from them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wish I could answer it unambiguously, but I think Mehdi gave an example of the iconic IPCC statement. It's a statement that, in my opinion, had very little alarming about it, and yet it was considered a policy-relevant statement that required we do something. And here you run into the problem of something I used to regard as the iron triangle of climate, where scientists make rather nondescript, innocent statements, not particularly alarmist. Environmental activists will translate it into something alarming. Politicians will be alarmed and feed money to the scientists.
Come on, scientists are alarmed too. There are plenty of scientists who are alarmed.
You know,
I quoted your own colleague at the MIT, Professor Kerry Emanuel.
I know.
Talked about collective risk to civilization. You don't agree with them, obviously.
I don't agree with him.
Okay, well, let's try and get some more audience before we have to. Who here disagrees with what they've been listening to from Professor Lindzen and would like to come in? That woman there at the back.
My question is about the link between temperature rise and possible effects such as droughts, famines, heat waves. And I've heard that around 300,000 people a year have actually lost their life due to extreme weather, which may be connected to climate change. And my question is, if there's any link between the CO2 that we're emitting and those deaths.
As far as I know, for the regions with good data, there is nothing exceptional happening. We've always had droughts. We always have floods.
But on the point of the kind of the human impact.
Yeah.
If, as we discussed earlier, if you're right, we've built too many wind farms, as David Rose put it. If you're wrong, tens of thousands of people are dying.
No.
The WHO says 150,000 people a year as a result of climate change.
Mehdi, there are lots of people who die. I mean,
no, the WHO has linked it directly to climate change. It has.
Yeah,
you may disagree with it, but it has.
How shall I put it? You can relate lots of deaths to changes in weather and climate that occur. I'm not arguing that natural climate variability is not associated with risks. I am arguing as to whether there is any evidence that there is anything other than natural climate variability. And if there isn't, to assign the deaths from climate that have occurred since time immemorial to man's activities today is a little bit specious.
Gentleman there with the glasses who's been very, very patient with the blue jacket.
Let's consider the following propositions. That the global warming is caused by man-made sources. Okay? Some people will say this proposition is probably correct. You would say this proposition is probably not correct. If the statement is true, there's catastrophic effect, especially for the poorest people in the world who are most vulnerable. And so we got to take that factor into consideration. If that statement turned out to be true and meant thousands and thousands of people die, would you be able to take that into your conscience? What is your threshold value for action?
What is your threshold for action if things go wrong?
Well, it depends on the action. If the action is purely symbolic, then we better think of a better way to help these people.
I worry that you're wrong, but I do hope for the sake of our planet that you're actually right.
Good.
Thank you very much to Richard Lindzen for joining us. Thanks to you all for coming to the Oxford Union for another episode of Head to Head, and thanks to you all at home for watching. We'll be back in the Oxford Union for another Head to Head. Good night.